I'm a former National Geographic photographer. I was based in Asia for about 2 decades, and I worked for Smithsonian Magazine as well and the New York Times, and I documented the rise of Asia. And I traveled a ton. My carbon footprint is a disaster. And I got to bear witness to the collapse of the old guard across Asia, and just the plain old, and then the rise of the new. And as many of us know here, that growth begets a lot of destruction. And I began to connect the dots. And it was quickly becoming easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Fast forward to around 2008, my first child was born, and I decided I had some responsibility to refocus what I was doing and look at climate change based on everything I had been experiencing while I was traveling around Asia. I decided to pick up and leave Asia and move back to New York City and set up my studio, an art studio this time, where I could start to weave in different narratives using materials and processes and scale. And my photography background came into play as well. And I wanted to try to weave in essentially a public consciousness. I wanted to look at the urgent existential nature of climate change and bring that up in the work to really communicate what I've been seeing and experiencing for so many years. So to jumpstart that, I did what any National Geographic photographer would do, and I called NASA. And I happened to call on the right time of day, at the right time of day, and spoke with the right person, and within a week, I was up flying on Operation Icebridge, which is a NASA mission that finished, I think about a year or two ago. And it was a patch for ICESat-1, which is a satellite that was mapping the cryosphere and the transformation of the cryosphere. And this series of flights would go out over the ice sheets for 8 hours a day. These are some of the glamour pictures from inside. This is actually a NOAA crew flying what was a hurricane hunting plane that we flew on some of the missions. You can see the engineers here working away. This is before we're taking off. And then here are all the toys, the scientists and the engineers. You see laser altimeters, gravimeters, magnetometers, radar. It's what you could see right there in the cutout of the floor of the plane. They literally cut a hole in the bottom of the plane to shoot these lasers right down into the ice. And then this is what the scientists are seeing inside. This is all the feedback, this is all the information, all the big data that they're collecting from the ice sheet. The temperature, what's happening to the core, how it's changing, and they're matching all this data up with effectively what's been recorded from the ice satellite that had been flying for many years. So this is the glacial melange coming off of the Jakobshavn Glacier. This is a galloping glacier. It's one of the world's largest and most important glaciers in Greenland. This glacier actually collapses right as we're arriving in front of the glacier. This is out of Kangerlussuaq in Greenland, where the NASA base is. And within a few minutes of arriving actually at the front of this land-terminating glacier, there was a crack, and we weren't ready. We weren't prepared to take pictures or anything yet. And so I whipped my camera out, and this whole shelf collapses right in front of us. So what we learned later was that when we were up there flying on this mission, that there was this omega block, which is what meteorologists call essentially when there's a formation, an omega formation, omega pattern, because of the high pressure system that kind of pushes all this hot air up over Greenland. And it created this melt that was historically unprecedented. What happened was as we were flying over the glacier, this is on April 11th of 2016, we saw these gigantic crystal blue melt pools. And it was just absolutely striking. And these melt pools kind of span the entire island, everywhere that we were flying. And we saw the ice disappearing before our very eyes out there. And this was historically unprecedented. This was the earliest melt in recorded history in Greenland, it turns out. And then, of course, there were all these other amazing textures on the surface of the ice, some of them extremely subtle, and some really pronounced, like this glacial melange from the Jakobshavn Glacier. So I took all these raw materials back to my studio and started developing a concept for an exhibition based around these works. The title of the show was called Earthworks, Mapping the Anthropocene, and I got to put it up a few miles down the road from Lago. And the show was a really big success for the museum. It was actually it got more press than any show in the 80-year history of the museum. This was at the Norton Museum of Art down in West Palm Beach. And it was the confluence of climate change and the president, who at the time was living down the road, the NASA flights, and it was just, good timing was right. As you might notice, these images are not printed on paper. They're actually printed onto polystyrene. And I did that for the irony of using a forever material that I thought really contrasted and really told another story. Here's a material that's going to last forever. Meanwhile, the glaciers that you see printed on these panels has already melted, or it's transformed or disappeared already. Some sea ice images. This is another video where one of my assistants is actually hand carving text into this series of panels. That's the finished artwork. So what we decided to do is try to be playful and start incorporating text. I wanted to weave text and language into the work to give it conceptually a more depth. We carved right into the polystyrene, and of course it revealed this glacial-like texture that was below the surface of the material. And then my friend Miranda Massey, who is the founder of the Climate Museum, she likes to say that not enough people are actually talking about climate change in reality. So we need to communicate. We need to get more people a greater vocabulary. My intention was to figure out ways to give people words, give people ideas and things to talk about, give them context to reflect upon. And in the ultimate act of love, in a homage to James Hanson, I tattooed his global surface temperature anomalies onto my right arm. And it goes from 1880 to 2016. And then on my left arm, I actually have an ice core, the Dome Sea ice core from Antarctica, which is about 1 million years of CO2 data, which a year later I tattooed onto my left arm. This is a really personal thing for me. I have 2 children. Their future is at stake. The future of our children are at stake, and billions of other children. So I have a horse in this race, which then led me to public art. And I wanted to figure out how to bring the broader public into this conversation. And before I knew it, I had a socially engaged art practice. This is up in the Anchorage Museum of Art, where that's my son, my eldest son, Dashiell, jumping in front of the signs there. And we actually set this up on the lawn of the Anchorage Museum and then invited the public to come and make their own signs. And we provided them all the materials. And they got to take those signs home and put them on their front lawns. And then I took over the marquees of downtown LA, using these eco-haikus that I worked on with this eco-philosopher. They're like public service announcements. Here's a billboard in Oklahoma City, right on a major highway. And then I began using solar-powered highway message boards, which some of you may have seen as this project took off and became quite popular, and we've been doing it all over the country and even overseas. And this began with this collaboration with an eco-philosopher who worked with me on a series of texts, and "We Are the Asteroid" was one of the first slogans we came up with. And then I got a call from Miranda Massey at the Climate Museum, and she said, "I'm working with the mayor's office of New York City, and we'd like to put 10 of these signs all around town." And the text we started using Spanish and French, Creole, Chinese, Russian, based on all the local demographics where the signs were placed. Here's the Chicago Navy Pier. And so, just to conclude, when a society is short on critical reflection, I think that's when art really has a critical role to play and to be deployed. Art can question and challenge our moral, philosophical, and aesthetic judgments. And art can help give us a new lens from which we can see the world. It can help transform us, our society, and our politics, one installation at a time. Thank you.